Hi, and welcome to this short introduction to the NHS Management Training Scheme aimed at programme and placement managers for trainees on the Management Training Scheme. I'm Fiona Rodden and I'm the Regional Lead for the Thames Valley and Wessex Leadership Academy, and that means that I'm the Regional Lead for the areas of Buckinghamshire, including Milton Keynes, Oxfordshire, Berkshire, Hampshire, including the Isle of Wight, and Dorset and Salisbury. So I just want you to be aware that this presentation is aimed for programme and placement managers in those regions. There are a few things that might be a little bit different if you're watching this outside those regions, and I will try to make those things clear as we go along, but it's really worth contacting your regional lead in your area if you're listening from outside. This presentation won't include all of the information on the scheme that you need to know. It's really important that you do look on Genie, where there is a lot of more information. I'll talk a little bit about that later on, and to also contact your regional lead. So, welcome to the scheme. Something that we found through doing the training with our local programme and placement managers is it's better to start right from the basics. So you might be listening to this and have been working with the scheme for quite a long time, but hopefully you'll find that covering some of the roots, so the foundations, and the basics of the scheme might be useful. So if not, then just skip over them. The purpose of the scheme, when it comes down to basics, is really threefold. First of all, it's to identify the next generation of leaders. They may be straight out of university, they may already have worked in the service for a number of years, so it's not necessarily just the younger generation. But we go through a really rigorous recruitment process. So this group of management trainees are, as a cohort, identified as this future generation of leaders. Secondly, it's really to fast track those great new upcoming leaders. As I said, this recruitment process is really thorough, and a lot of it is also values based. So it's not just on experience and sort of leadership potential, but there's also a lot about attitude and values. So you won't see a trainee that gets onto the scheme unless they are truly passionate about improving patient and staff experience. They're not just required to sort of think differently, but also really positively. An example of that is one of the things they look for in the interviews is not just a willingness to approach change and to lead change and challenge, but it's an actual real hunger and love of that challenge as well. These people that get through the recruitment process really encompass the values of the NHS Constitution. They really care about improving patient care. They won't get on if they don't demonstrate that. And a big part of it is to to develop these people who can really inspire and be role models for leadership. So one of the things that you would expect from your trainees is that even at this really early stage, they should be considering themselves as role models, as affecting other people, because they've gone through this high recruitment process. A big part of the scheme is to enable these trainees to understand their own and others' values and cultures. They spend a lot of time in different parts of the NHS, and a really big important part of that is to be able to understand the different challenges and the different issues. And we'll talk a little bit about that during the orientation stuff. So just a little bit of background on the scheme. It's a multi-award winning scheme, and it's regularly in the Times 100 top graduates programmes, often in the top 5 and 10. So it's consistently a really well regarded scheme across sectors. Less than 1% of applicants get onto the scheme. I think this year it was about 12,000 applications for 100 spaces, and that's a few less spaces than we've had in previous years due to all the pressures with the economic climate. So the trainee, once they've come through to your organisation, has done really, really well to get to where they are. They've gone through a whole series of online tests, including personality assessments, situational judgment tests, verbal reasoning and numerical reasoning. And then once they get through to the next stage, they've gone through competency-based interviews. And as I mentioned before, they're not just based on experience and potential for leadership, but they're also looking at the attitudes and values of our leaders for the future. After that, they go through to a day's assessment centre where they're really put through their paces with some quite challenging situations to see in a situation how they will respond. And again, that's competency-based and linked to the leadership framework. So as I said, we've got 100 trainees nationally joining us in 2013, and in Thames Valley and Wessex, that means we've got 10 in our area, which is about right for all the different areas. We have 5 general trainees who focus on general management, 2 informatics who are very focused on the information side and project management of that side of the NHS, HR and finance, obviously sort of self-explanatory there. The scheme is either 2 years long or 2.5 years long, depending on which stream the trainee's on. For HR, General Management and Informatics, it's 2 years, and for Finance, it's 2.5 years, and that's because they're undertaking a CIMA qualification in accountancy, so with that educational element, it just takes a little bit longer. They start on the 2nd of September this year, with 20 days of orientation. So their first day is a national induction in Leeds, and historically every year David Nicholson has attended that induction, and so this scheme has got real support from the top. David Nicholson himself was a trainee on this management training scheme. So on the 3rd of September they start their orientation. So if your trainee has quite a long way to come back from Leeds, they're staying in Leeds on the 2nd of September overnight, so just bear that in mind for their first day's orientation. And that's 20 working days if they have education during that time, and I'm pretty sure that Finance do, then that just gets extended for a few more days in the month. The first placement is typically quite operational, so while some trainees are coming in from the service, many others are coming in never having worked in the service before. So getting this operational grounding, no matter what specialism, is really important early on because it gets them to understand the service from the ground floor, really. For Finance trainees, that placement's 8 months long, it's a little bit shorter. And for General HR and Informatics, it's almost a year long, it's 11 months. For Finance trainees, historically, their programme manager has been in their second organisation, the blue one on here, but in Thames Valley and Wessex this year, we have made the programme managers in the first organisation, and that's to allow for some of the changes that we are considering making in year, but it's also well regarded in terms of the trainee having a programme manager as somebody that they meet in their first organisation, because typically for the scheme, trainees often have a lot of the issues that they're going to have right at the beginning, so it just means that they've got that additional support from you in that first organisation. So for the general HR and informatics, it's always been that programme and placement managers are both in that first organisation. For finance trainees, placement managers are always in every organisation, but the programme manager in the first organisation is new this year for Thames Valley and Wessex. The final placement is often referred to as the second placement, but as you can probably see from this diagram, it's actually not the second placement. But it's typically a bit more strategic for the HR, General Management and Informatics trainees. So that might mean working in a commissioning environment or potentially in an NHS provider, but in a much more strategic role. Historically, it's often been that in the first placement they work in an acute trust, and second organisation was a PCT or something similar, but obviously with the structures changing, we've also got a lot more community providers and primary care providers, so it's never quite as clear cut as it has been over previous years, but that just gives you a bit of a guide of the different types of placement that they'll have. For the finance trainees, in their final placement, which is split between in the same organisation, they will move around between different departments, doing different jobs, and that's quite similar for HR and informatics trainees, where the knowledge that they build up is very specialist. So they need to be able to understand the different departments within finance or HR. For general and informatics trainees, they might move around a bit within a placement, but typically they would stay within a role, as it gives a bit of stability and it enables them to put in place service improvement projects and see them through from beginning to end. The flexi placement is a 2-month placement, and it's at different times for the finance and HR, general management, informatics trainees. And this placement is across the country, an organisation within reason of their choosing. The main decision point here is that it has to have value to NHS services and to patients and service users on return to the NHS after their flexi placement. There are a whole series of guidelines on Genie, and I recommend that you have a look at those. It is the responsibility of the programme manager to help the trainee arrange their flexi placement. In Thames Valley and Wessex, we've made a move this year to enabling the trainees to decide where they spend their second placement. Now, the decision was made in our area because we felt it made the trainees own their scheme a lot better. It means that they work with their programme manager and their mentor and the regional lead to really look at their competency needs and their personal development plan, take a lot more ownership and decide how they're going to stretch themselves. In some areas it's decided for them, and there are good reasons for doing that as well, and that's historically what we've done. But just to bear in mind, if you're watching this in a different area, that's one that's different for us. One of the things that an organisation commits to in taking on a first placement trainee is to arrange their orientation. And that is, as I said, 20 days of induction into the whole of the health services. So that's not just your organisation, but it's a series of different organisations across the system, and likely to include not just public healthcare, but also private. Within Thames Valley and Wessex, we are quite keen that the trainee might bank a few days of their orientation that they can then draw on later during their placement, their first placement, to really just continue some of that orientation and create this culture of always finding out about different experiences, different issues in other sides of the system. So it is really important that this orientation is not just in your organisation, but it's in a whole host of organisations throughout healthcare and social care. There's a link on this slide to take you to the guidance on Genie to give you some ideas of where that might be arranged. But one of the things that we have had feedback from trainees and placements is it's actually quite a good idea to book probably the first week or so of orientation, and then support the trainee to arrange much of the rest of their orientation, because that really helps them to develop this proactive quality, develop the networks themselves, and really own that orientation as well as their whole placement. It also can help them to make quite meaningful connections. It's quite a good opportunity to both receive feedback and learning from the trainee and to find out more about the trainee. So one of the things that we really encourage is for trainees to do a presentation to the board or the divisional group that they're working in, to really embed some of that learning for themselves, but also help others to benefit from their experience in other parts of the system. Likewise, it's quite a good opportunity if your trainee is spending time with somebody in your network to get a bit of feedback on how they come across, what's their impact, so that you can really support that trainee and help them to develop, challenge themselves, and really improve throughout their placement with you. Education is a really important part of the graduate management training scheme, and all of the trainees, no matter what their stream, will undertake some similar parts, some core aspects, as well as some tailored parts for their individual stream. The dates for those education at the time of publication, so we're looking at about July, are in the workbook that we've given to programme placement managers that's aimed at trainees. So there's a diary section in the back, and this is available, or should be available, all around the country very soon, and it will have those dates so that you can avoid certain meetings or things with that trainee on days of their education. It also helps you to know when they're going to be away. All trainees, no matter what their stream, undertake the Edward Jenner programme. That's 21 online modules, each of about 40 minutes, and they should all have access from now, July 2013, and they need to complete them before the end of October. Now, this is the first of the NHS Leadership Academy's core programmes, and it's designed for those that are really just starting off in the world of leadership. So it's a really quite a good introduction to that world. That programme's actually free to take on, so if you do want to share that programme with others in your organisation, then just go onto the Leadership Academy website and you'll get details on how to apply for that. All trainees will also undertake the Mary Seacole programme, which is the second of the core leadership programmes, and this is for people moving into their first leadership role within the NHS. And it's a combination of online and group learning. They focus quite a bit on emotional intelligence, leadership styles, and other aspects of leadership, using some academic models and applying them to working, everyday work. Part of that programme is also that they'll undertake a service improvement project, and it's really encouraged, particularly in our area, but really across the board, that project be multi-professional, so that they really get exposure to working with different groups of people, different backgrounds, different assumptions and understandings to really improve your service. So it's really worth talking to your trainee about what they're thinking they might want to do for that service improvement project, so that it really benefits your organisation. That programme gives them a postgraduate certificate in healthcare leadership. After that, the trainees split into their specialisms. The general trainees undertake the third of the NHS core leadership programmes. They do the second third of that programme. It's in sort of 3 sections, so they don't complete it 100%, but they can look at topping that up later. That gives them a postgrad diploma in health leadership. And they'll do that with the Manchester Business School and Birmingham Health Sciences Management Centre, who've run the education training for general management trainees for quite a while now, so they're really well placed to do that. The finance trainees undertake their CIMA through Kaplan. They do have quite a bit more education time than other trainees, so if you're new to having a finance trainee, it's worth really thinking about what they might be able to do while still having quite a lot of time out for education. And as I said before, that's 2.5 years long. For informatics trainees, they do a postgrad diploma in health informatics with University College London. It's again 2 years long, and it's specific for health informatics. So there's some technical aspects to it and some project management aspects. And talk to your informatics trainee more about that programme. And then the human resources trainees, the HR trainees, are with a new provider this year, Leeds University. And again, HR management, quite a lot of technical stuff there, a lot of policy work, and they do have, as with all of the streams, I think perhaps a little less so with finance, they have some influence over the content of their education work and their assignments. And we really recommend to trainees, it's really important to tailor those assignments to really tie in with your work, because not only then does the learning become much deeper, it also really brings benefit back to that organisation, back to patients, so that's really important. All trainees undertake action learning, and this year the new development is that they will be facilitated by alumni of the scheme and clinical fellows. And if you're not sure what action learning is, it's sort of group coaching where trainees are encouraged to develop their own solutions rather than just getting advice from others. So it's a really supportive peer group that can help trainees to really address some of the issues, some of the learning that they're facing in their work and in their education. All trainees do experiential learning. Historically, that's been done by the King's Fund, and it's been taken on this year by the NHS Leadership Academy. And experiential learning is really about throwing trainees into challenging situations to really see how they respond and learn in a really different way. For trainees who have exams, study days are arranged with the placement manager as appropriate, just to make sure that they've got the time to be able to revise for those exams. Trainees who just have assignment-based work, coursework, don't have study days agreed up front, but what we say in Thames Valley and Wessex is this is really down to the trainee and the placement manager and line manager to arrange as they see appropriate. We obviously don't want anyone to be out of the trust more than necessary, but it really just does depend on the trainee. It's really important for the organisations to support trainees' learning, and I say it's a bit like good parenting, where the more interest the placement and programme managers show in their education, the better the trainees seem to do in their outcomes from that learning and also in their qualifications. So again, it's really important to tie in their learning with their work so that it benefits the organisations, and the trainees will just learn so much more from it as well. The competencies are the leadership behaviours that a trainee must have experienced and demonstrated during their time on the scheme. There's no set plan for how they achieve those competencies throughout their time, but the outcome is they must have had approved at least 90% of those competencies, those behaviours, by the end of the scheme. They're based on the leadership framework at the refresh in 2011 and 12. That model is being refreshed this year, but for 2013 trainees, they'll work to the same competencies as trainees from last year. There are core elements and specialism-specific elements, and that really just reflects that a lot of the leadership behaviours really need to be demonstrated no matter what your specialism, but there are a lot of technical aspects, technical knowledge that does need to be learned for the relevant stream. It's evidence of achievement and experience, and it's really important that it's not a tick box exercise, because the trainees that do approach it like a tick box exercise really don't get the most out of this. The way I tend to describe it to trainees is this is your map of all of the different skills that you need to have demonstrated in order to be able to get the right job at the end of the scheme and show that you've got that really varied experience. And we also advise trainees to really think about the work that they want to do and how that really fits in with their competencies, and use it as a lever to make sure that they get that right experience. And in the same way, I would absolutely advise programme and placement managers to look at what work would be really valuable to patients and the service users in your trust, what would be really useful to have a trainee work on, and how does that fit with their competencies. Really recommend that you spend a bit of time at the beginning of the first placement, and probably at the beginning of the second placement as well, if the trainee's spending their second placement with you, to look at what competencies the trainee has left, what work you've got going on, and how those two really might be met by the work. So that you've got maybe a couple of contingency plans if some project doesn't really go through, and it just saves the drama of coming to the end of the placement and actually not being sure that those competencies have been met. It's really quite a good way to plan out a placement as well, so it can help to set quite clear objectives for the trainee, which really just help them to manage their own achievements throughout the scheme. Quite important to review them regularly. A lot of trainees do tend to just go to review them just before the performance reviews, and actually by kind of regularly keeping on top of them, it's a good way of just making sure that they're staying on track. In the workbook that I'm going to plug shamelessly throughout this presentation, there's also within the calendar some post-it notes at the top of the page to give a guide on what point the trainee really should have got to with their competencies. Now, those are just guides, but broadly speaking, they should have about 40% of their competencies achieved at the end of the first year, so that they're really on track to achieve the 90% or to 100% over the whole scheme. In terms of being eligible to graduate, all trainees, I mean, it's really quite obvious they need to have undertaken all of their placements. Every now and then we get a trainee requesting to go back to their first placement for their second placement, and we're really not very supportive of that, because, and that's locally as well as nationally, because the whole point of this scheme is really to get that varied experience throughout the NHS, and that's really what you get with a trainee who's gone through the scheme. They really understand different parts of the NHS and healthcare. They need to have passed all their education, so again it's really important to make sure that that trainee's on track with their education, with their that they've got enough time and they're putting enough focus into achieving that. That they've achieved their performance reviews, and it's worth pointing out that after their, I think it's their second or their third performance review that takes place just before sort of now time, actually it's sort of July, that corresponds to a potential pay uplift for September, so for the new year each year. And so it's really important that that one is done on time, though really it's worth making sure that they're all on time, because it really helps the trainee to manage their own progression through the scheme. They need to have attended all of their action learning and experiential learning, and so really do bear that in mind in terms of requiring trainees to be at particular meetings, because if they're not attending those things, they're not rerun, there is the chance of them not completing the scheme. They need to have a personal development plan in place, and I think the actual requirement is to have one in place by the end of the scheme, though I really, really recommend to trainees to develop it much earlier so that they can think about what kind of role they see themselves in the future, sort of 10, 20 years, to the one, bringing it right back down to where they want to come out at the end of the scheme. And that personal development plan, I describe to trainees as how are you really going to get that first job? What do you need to have experienced? What roles do you need to have undertaken in order to be eligible for that job interview at the end of the scheme? And of course they need to have achieved their competencies at just over 90% as well. It's really important to have regular one-to-ones with your trainee. This is one of the biggest sticking points for trainees, particularly with programme managers, but also with placement managers. And those one-to-ones are not just for monitoring the work, but it's really their overall performance, including their education, how they're getting on with their competencies, how well their work is really contributing to that, how their work's contributing to patients as well is really important. How their continuing professional development and personal development plan are coming along. There may be specific CPD that you want them to do in your organisation that's relevant for their role, often things like appraisal training, things like that that really help them to do their role. Networking is really important, particularly for looking for work at the end of the scheme, so just checking out that they're making contacts. If you're able to help them within your own personal network, then that's really great, and that's something that comes across so well as a sort of successful placement. And generally their conduct, their impact, how are they working within the team. It's also a really great opportunity to get feedback to and from the trainee, and this really helps just to tailor that placement and make sure that it's really challenging them. And again, it's really, the feedback you get from trainees is that they're under-challenged, not over-challenged. So it's really important to challenge them, but provide a bit of a safe space and have those regular one-to-ones just to make sure that they're doing what they need to be doing. Genie is the new system for monitoring progress and keeping information on trainees and about the scheme. We've had a few changeovers in systems over the last few years, and if you're new to Genie, I will say it's a lot better than we've had previously. It's really quite easy to use. It's sort of quite similar to a social media type website where it's all pretty self-explanatory and you don't really require any kind of training just to get on it. If you need a login to Genie and need to be registered as a programme or placement manager, the easiest thing is to email Nashina Kiani, and I'll give you her email address a bit later on in the presentation, and she handles all those sorts of things, so you're not waiting for a response from us. This is just a snapshot of the front page of Genie once you've logged in. And as I said, this is the tool to monitor the progress of trainees, and it is a lot easier to use than we've had previously. All of the relevant information that you should need or want should be on the documents section, the information section of Genie. So if you're worried or wondering about any particular part of it, that's really the first place to have a look, because they've got some really great guide documents on there. I mentioned before the orientation guide to help you find what you need to do. There's role descriptions on there for program placement managers, all the details of the competencies and the wording for what they need to do, as well as a really great forum for discussion, so that answers can come to all trainees rather than just one specific trainee. It's predominantly placement managers that will need to go into Genie more than program managers. They'll need to approve any competencies, leave, their performance reviews, really all the sort of normal line management responsibilities. They need to be recorded on Genie so that the NHS Leadership Academy and the Thames Valley and Wessex Leadership Academy have access to that information. For program managers, the main one is signing off their flexi placements. So it's just making sure that all sort of statement of commitments from the organisation that they're going to, and that's a commitment really not to poach the trainee, that they're going to look after the trainee and develop them, give them time for their education, making sure that that's signed off and on there, that you're happy with the plan that they're undertaking for their flexi placement and things like that. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the different roles of people working with trainees on the scheme, and bear in mind that depending on which region you're in, this might be a little bit different. Programme managers are responsible for the trainee throughout the whole of the 2 years of their programme. They are now, for all specialisms in Thames Valley and Wessex, in their first organisation. And we've done that for the finance trainees historically have had the programme managers in their second organisation because that was the placement they were in for the longest. But the feedback that we've had is actually having that really good contact early on is really important, so that relationship can be built through those regular one-to-ones, and that relationship then continues while the trainee moves on into another trust. They are typically a really senior manager in the relevant field, with active CPD, an expert in the field that the trainee is working in. In some areas, in some organisations, the programme manager might be from the leadership team, the leadership development or learning team, and that's fine as well, so long as that person has regular contact with the trainee and that they're able to network them to people who are experts in the field but outside of their line management responsibilities should the need arise. They'd meet and have regular one-to-ones, ideally monthly to quarterly later on in the placement, and that's just to make sure that the placement's going well, that they are networking, that their education is going well, much the same responsibilities as with a placement manager, but it's just sort of working with somebody at a different level, and also to really put them in touch with people for orientation and networking, as is right for your network. You'll also, programme managers help the trainees to arrange their flexi placements, as I mentioned before, but also their second placements. And this is quite new for Thames Valley and Wessex area this year. Historically, that second placement has been arranged with some input from the trainee, but this year we've changed it particularly for the 2012 intake, so that they've got much more responsibility for organising their second placement. The regional team, that's us in Thames Valley and Wessex, we will work with the programme managers and the trainee and their mentor to make sure that there's balance across the region, so that we don't sort of clump up with trainees. But really, the reason for the trainees organising this second placement is to really encourage this proactivity, networking, having a much better understanding of the whole healthcare system, and also really much more proactively managing their own personal development plan and their competencies. So we believe that it's so that the trainee will come out at the end of the scheme being much more ready to get a role in the real world. So anyway, as programme managers, key responsibilities are making sure that orientation is in place, and that might not be that every day is booked, but that they have the right support to make those contacts, make those networks. What we would tend to advise is that the first 5 to 10 days are arranged, and that the trainee has responsibility for arranging the rest of it. The programme manager is also really responsible for the quality of the trainee's placement in their organisation, and just making sure that the quality of the placement outside their organisation is also good. So it's really important that programme manager has that objective viewpoint. The The placement manager is responsible for the trainee while they're on that placement. Typically, they tend to be the line manager, but in some organisations, for some placements, that trainee might be working on a number of different projects, and so it may not be their line manager, but it's somebody that has that level of contact with the trainee. They work at a band 7 or above, that we have active CPD, an expert in their field, and would meet with them on a sort of weekly to monthly basis. And again, as I'll reiterate, it's not just for work and line management feedback and conversation, but their whole training experience, as mentioned before. They will have responsibility for the design and delivery of the placement, and making sure that it's tailored to the competencies, making sure that it's tailored to the organisational needs, and that that trainee will really have some proper achievements to show for at the end of their scheme, at the end of their placement. The sponsor role is one that's changed quite a lot over the last several years. It used to have a much bigger role with the training scheme, but then with the introduction of leadership development managers when the scheme was with the Institute, these roles really kind of, in our area at least, tended to sort of move away a bit. And we're really looking to really sort of strengthen these roles now. The sponsor is typically either the chief exec or a director in the relevant field, and they work at that really senior level, and it's to give that senior informal mentoring within the organisation, so that that trainee has the sort of networks and the strategic understanding, the political understanding within their organisation. They tend to meet 2 to 3 times per placement, and obviously that's totally dependent on the sponsor and the trainee. And it should be mutually beneficial, so that the trainee can provide feedback on the organisation and the local health economy from their orientation, as well as the sponsor mentoring that trainee. The national lead does exactly that, really. A lot of the scheme is sort of relatively generic across the country. Sonia Strutek is the lead now for the Graduate Management Training Scheme. She's supported by predominantly Noshina, the coordinator, and Noshina is the one to email when you've got sort of general queries about the scheme that are at a national level, so they're the same all over, but again, more than happy for you to contact me, Fiona Rodden, as well. Harriet Howard was somebody recommended to talk to, particularly around the education stuff, so she leads on those aspects. But those are the team to talk to for those aspects of the scheme, like education, online system issues, policies, and sort of development of the scheme. The mentor is somebody working at a very senior level, ideally outside the organisation, and really I'd say that the important thing with a mentor is that they really shouldn't have any conflict of interest for that trainee, to be able to provide the right advice and the guidance, coaching and networking that really helps that trainee to develop. Trainees tend to meet their mentor during orientation, so it's really important that they do some of that networking during that orientation time. We tend to give trainees quite a bit of advice on how to choose a mentor, and if you look in the workbook that we've developed this year for the trainees, there's a whole section on how to select a mentor if you want to help them find one. In Thames Valley and Wessex, we also have an active network, online register of mentors, so there is always a kind of good way to get a mentor if the trainee doesn't meet someone on their orientation. Every year the trainee has a buddy and is a buddy, and what that really means is somebody in the year above who gives them a bit of help, advice and support, can really identify what's a normal problem and what's actually not normal, just to really help that trainee to sort of gauge how they're doing compared to their peers. They're really a great resource also for supporting them with orientation planning, because the trainees, their buddy has been through it and they can recommend things that were particularly useful or enjoyable that the new trainee may want to experience. This year in Thames Valley and Wessex, we allocated trainees with 2 buddies from the year above, And the reason we did that was sort of twofold. One is because however you pair up two people, you can't guarantee what the relationship will be like. So it was sort of to help the trainees to make sure that those buddy relationships work, whether that's with both of their buddies or just with one of them. So it's a sort of fail-safe, really. But the other reason is because often the trainees commented that there wasn't enough mixing across the different streams or the different groups. And so we're really keen to make sure that the trainees not only had a buddy within their specialism, but also a buddy outside their specialism, so that they could really understand more about the scheme from another perspective. The regional lead for our area is the Thames Valley and Wessex Leadership Academy, and that's me, Fiona Rodden, with my email address just underneath, so please do use it if you've got any queries. I'm really happy for people to just ask a question rather than sitting there and wondering, or there being any problem with your trainee or with your placement because you're afraid to ask, so please do ask. We are responsible for the local aspects, so a lot of that is the sort of placement coordination, making sure that placements are right for the trainees and that the trainees are right for the placements. We're doing the induction and the training, and this training online will be available to other areas, so if you're unsure of who your local lead is, then contact Nashina and she'll be able to put you in contact. And we also are really here to support programme managers so that you're not on your own. This year, particularly for Thames Valley and Wessex, programme managers are having a much more active role, so we are absolutely here to just help you to get the most out of your trainee. Okay, and finally we finish with some top tips that come from both local experience and a national study that was done with trainees to ask what's really useful for programme and placement managers to really make the most out of the trainee, as well as to help the trainee get the most out of the scheme. So encouraging the trainee to be proactive in developing solutions is a really key thing here, and well regarded by the trainees, and really important for developing the right attitudes for trainees going out into the world after the end of the scheme. Giving regular constructive feedback. It's one of the things that a lot of people in any role are often a little bit nervous about giving constructive feedback. But the point is that it's really about clarifying objectives, making the trainee know what their impact is, helping them to develop their self-awareness. So this is a really important commitment that you're making in taking on a trainee. It's also really important to set up challenges for the trainee. As I said before, we get more trainees complaining that they're not being challenged enough rather than those that are being challenged too much. So absolutely have that conversation with your trainee and regularly check in to make sure that how they're doing, but don't be afraid of really setting them up with some challenging work. They really should be working at a relatively senior level, so this scheme is really about putting people in a fast track scheme that kind of drops them into really significant situations and helps them develop the skills to really manage that for after the scheme. So absolutely do challenge them. Remember, you're a role model, because for a lot of trainees this is their first job in NHS management. So some people come in from the service, but most of them don't, and so the impression that you leave with them is often very much an impression of the whole of the NHS and the whole of NHS leadership. So not wanting to put on too much pressure, but do remember that you're being a role model for them. It's very important to set clear objectives and follow up on them. So in some organisations that might mean a really clear job description and plan. In others it's just really about those objectives and those outcomes, so that the trainee is really clear on what's required of them and making sure that they can achieve it and deliver what you need for your organisation, as well as making their achievements for the scheme. The key one, in centre, if you're not sure, please ask. We're really at the end of an email or the end of a phone, so it's really important to get in contact with your regional lead, and for Thames Valley and Wessex to get in contact with me. I'd really like to hear from you, so if you're watching this presentation and you haven't hosted a trainee yet, but you're still interested in hosting a trainee, please also get in touch. Thanks very much. I hope to speak to you soon.